Welcome to the Faith and Mental Health Podcast, where we explore the intersection of faith and mental health, of course. And so I'm your host, Bolden, and today we're going to be addressing the topic of prolonged grief disorder. This is a condition that deeply impacts individuals that are struggling to move forward after a major or significant loss. And so if you tuned into the last episode, I talked about navigating grief during the holidays. I also had another post on the Faith and Mental Health social media where we just talked about a lot of the issues and challenges that people really deal with during the holidays, because we know the holidays are not a great time for everyone. And so I realized that a lot of people are really struggling with grief, and that the holidays can kind of exacerbate it for some people. And so I thought it was important to bring this discussion to light. And so I want to talk about first, what is prolonged grief disorder? And so we know as human beings that grief and death and loss are a part of life. But for some people, the grieving process can become so weighty and so overwhelming that it begins to disrupt their ability to kind of live a full and functional life. And so this is where, for some people, prolonged grief disorder can come in. And so prolonged grief disorder is recognized in the DSM-5 TR, which stands for the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, 5th edition text revision, because I believe the 5th edition came out in like 2013, and the text revision came out in maybe like 2022. Excuse me if I'm wrong. And then this prolonged grief disorder is also found in the ICD-11, which is the International Classification of Diseases. So with it being in those two things, it's diagnosable and it's billable and it's treatable. And so prolonged grief disorder is marked by a prolonged and intense grief response that lasts at least 12 months in adults, significantly impairing their daily life and functioning. And for children, I believe the time frame is more, maybe around like 6 months. And so some of the symptoms of prolonged grief disorders includes intense longing or yearning for the deceased, a difficulty accepting the death, avoiding reminders of the deceased, an emotional numbness, or even feeling that life has lost its meaning. So unlike normal grief or more typical grief, which gradually lessens over time, people that are struggling with prolonged grief disorder, it seems the grief remains unrelenting and debilitating. This is really tough for people to deal with, because they kind of become stuck in a sense. And so not everyone who experiences a major loss or that's dealing with grief is going to develop prolonged grief disorder. And so some of the factors that may increase the likelihood of someone developing prolonged grief disorder is the loss of a loved one under violent, traumatic, or very unexpected circumstances. Multiple losses, one behind another, major losses, lack of a supportive community or social network, a history of mental health issues such as trauma, depression, or anxiety, high dependence on the deceased for emotional or practical needs, and then also challenging financial or any type of social stressors behind the death and departure of the loved one. Now, from a faith perspective, unresolved spiritual questions like why God allowed the loss to happen can also complicate the grieving process, because as believers, typically we expect God to be a part of the process as we try to heal and walk through and work through the loss, right? But because we know that he's near the brokenhearted and he binds their wounds. And we know that he's a very present help in the time of trouble. And we know that God will never leave us nor forsake us. But sometimes when people are dealing with some significant and major losses like that, it can cause some spiritual questions that may not allow them to lean on their faith the way they should or they could. And so, as people of faith, we know that grief is never a sign of weakness, but rather it's what? A natural response to love and loss. I found a very good quote, and it has really just stuck with me. It said that grief is love with no place to go. Grief is love with no place to go. And I said, man, that makes a lot of sense. But when grief becomes prolonged, it's essential to seek support. Therapy can be a critical tool for healing alongside prayer and spiritual guidance. So evidence-based treatments like PGT, which is prolonged grief treatment, is a special type of treatment for people dealing with prolonged grief disorder. Cognitive behavioral therapy sometimes can be used, and that's one that more people probably have heard of, to help address maybe some of the unhelpful thought patterns related to the loss. In some cases, some people may also need some type of medication to be used alongside therapy, especially for those that may be dealing with multiple conditions or issues, including something like major depression. But healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means finding a way to honor your loved one's memory while continuing to live out your purpose. I love that quote. I love the other quote, how I said, grief is love with no place to go. Because the big thing we have to remember when it comes to grief and death and loss is that those that remain, we have to keep living. We have to keep pushing. We have to keep going. And so it's so important that we understand that, grief is a part of life, but recognize that when grief is crippling us as a person, it's so imperative to get help. So faith communities can play a vital role in supporting people that are dealing with prolonged grief disorder. I don't know why I want to keep saying progressive, but prolonged. If I said progressive anywhere, I meant to say prolonged. But by creating safe spaces to share their grief and providing resources like grief support groups or spiritual counseling, we can help other people find a path to healing. So I want to share a couple of steps that faith communities can take. They can educate leaders and members about prolonged grief disorder and its impact. We can encourage. My church does a lot of this. We promote counseling and professional mental health services. And so encouraging people to get professional services alongside of prayer and spiritual support, offering grief workshops or seminars to address faith-related questions about loss. So I think it's important to understand that healing, it can involve both spiritual and practical steps. And so sometimes in the church, we can be guilty of of only addressing the spiritual and never acknowledging or addressing the practical things that can be done. So I just want to say this before this episode comes to an end. First, I want to say thank you to everybody that's tuning in. Thank you for those that are subscribed to the podcast. Please subscribe. Please, consider giving us a great rating. We want to get this growing and get it going again. But if you or someone you love is struggling with prolonged grief or dealing with grief, or you think someone is dealing with prolonged grief, it's not your job to diagnose yourself. That's the role of professional mental health providers. But if you think like, hey, maybe I need some help, or so-and-so needs help, listen, you're not alone. They're not alone. There's help, there's healing, and there's support available by getting the therapy, by leaning on your faith, and by staying connected to community. We can't do it alone. We don't need to be alone. Being isolated in times like that is not necessarily the best thing or the healthiest thing to do. And so we need each other. And so I want to say thank you for tuning in. And so to this episode of the Faith and Mental Health Podcast. And so if this particular episode connected with you, resonated with you, if it made sense to you, anything, please share it with somebody who you think might benefit. Please make sure you subscribe, consider the things that were shared. And so until next time, remember to take care of yourself, body, soul, and spirit. We know 1 Thessalonians 5:23 says, I pray the Lord will sanctify you wholly, body, soul, and spirit. So take care of the whole you and trust that God is walking with each and every one of us through every season of our lives. Thank you for tuning in. God bless.